Princess Diana ever discussed him?
Yes, very fondly, actually.
Really?
Yeah.
When you look back, was there one particular time when you and Princess Diana just had a ball together?
Elton John and Princess Diana always seemed like an odd pairing on paper. One was a flamboyant rock star from working-class Pinner, the other a young aristocrat who would become the most photographed woman on the planet. Yet for 16 years, until her death in 1997, they shared one of the most genuine friendships either of them ever had, and much of what the public thinks it knows about that friendship has been softened, simplified, or turned into royal legend. Elton has spent decades slowly filling in the real picture, first in interviews, then in his 2019 autobiography Me, and what emerges is not a fairy tale but something more human, two famous, lonely people who found in each other a rare place to be unguarded. The story begins in 1981, at Windsor Castle, at a party that had nothing to do with Diana at all. Elton had been booked to perform at Prince Andrew's 21st birthday celebration, alongside percussionist Ray Cooper. He was already familiar with royal circles by that point. The Queen Mother and Princess Margaret had been fans of his music since the 1970s, and he had become something of a fixture at private family gatherings, a rock star who had somehow been let inside the velvet rope of the British establishment. That night at Windsor, the ballroom held a discotheque that had been turned down so low, according to Elton, that guests could hear their own shoes scraping the floor over the music. Before he even took the stage, Elton found himself pulled onto the dance floor with Princess Anne and Queen Elizabeth II herself, all of them swaying awkwardly to Bill Haley's Rock Around the Clock while Elton tried to arrange his face into something resembling composure. It was into this stiff, glittering scene that a 19-year-old Diana Spencer walked, newly engaged to Prince Charles and not yet a princess. Elton later wrote that she possessed an effortless social ease, a gift for making the people around her feel ordinary and comfortable rather than intimidated by her presence. That quality struck him immediately, because so much of royal life ran on formality and distance, and here was a teenager who seemed instinctively able to cut through it. She wrote him a thank you note afterward, and that small gesture opened the door to a friendship that would deepen steadily over the following years, built less on royal protocol and more on shared humor and an appetite for gossip. Elton would later describe her as wonderful company at a dinner table, someone who was, in his words, remarkably indiscreet and always willing to share what she knew. What made the relationship durable wasn't just the laughter, though there was plenty of that. Both of them lived extraordinarily public lives that came with a private cost, and both understood what it meant to perform a version of themselves for cameras while carrying something heavier underneath. Diana was adjusting to a marriage that would eventually collapse under intense media scrutiny, and Elton had his own well-documented struggles with fame and addiction during those years. Around each other, by most accounts, they didn't have to keep performing. That was the real currency of their friendship, not proximity to power, but the relief of being known. Their bond found a serious purpose in the mid-1980s, when the AIDS epidemic began devastating communities in fashion, music, and the arts, industries both of them moved through constantly. At the time, public understanding of HIV transmission was riddled with fear and misinformation, and people living with the virus were frequently isolated, shunned, and denied basic compassion, even in hospital settings. Elton watched friends and colleagues die while facing that stigma firsthand, and it left him furious. Diana felt the same urgency. In April 1987, she opened one of the first dedicated HIV and AIDS units in the country at London's Middlesex Hospital, and in a moment that was widely reported at the time, she shook a patient's hand without wearing gloves, a small physical act that carried enormous symbolic weight in an atmosphere of panic and misinformation. It helped shift public perception at a moment when that shift mattered enormously. Diana's advocacy on this front is credited by many historians and AIDS charities as one of the more consequential uses of her public platform, and it directly informed Elton's own path, eventually leading him to establish the Elton John AIDS Foundation, which remains one of the largest AIDS charities in the world today. For several years, their friendship and their advocacy ran on parallel tracks, each of them lending visibility to a cause the establishment was still reluctant to fully confront. Diana went on to visit AIDS wards repeatedly throughout the late 1980s and into the 1990s, often without press cameras present, sitting with patients, holding their hands, and simply spending time with people who had been abandoned by their own families out of fear. Historians and public health researchers have since pointed to those visits as genuinely influential in shifting British attitudes toward HIV and AIDS at a moment when government messaging was still cautious and public understanding was dangerously thin. Elton, for his part, channeled his grief and anger into building an organization rather than simply mourning privately, and the Elton John AIDS Foundation has since raised hundreds of millions of dollars for prevention, treatment, and research programs around the world. In interviews given decades later, Elton has credited Diana's example, her willingness to physically sit beside people society wanted to avoid, as something that shaped how he thought about using his own platform. It wasn't a relationship built only on parties and gossip. In other words, it had a serious, shared moral core that outlasted plenty of other celebrity friendships of that era. Hindsight, precisely because it was so avoidable. Elton was putting together a coffee table photography book called Rock and Royalty, created with his friend, the designer Gianni Versace, with proceeds going to the Elton John AIDS Foundation. Diana had agreed to write the book's foreword, a meaningful gesture of support for a cause she cared about. But shortly before publication, she withdrew, at a point when the decision caused real financial and logistical strain for the project. According to Elton's own account in his memoir, she claimed she hadn't been aware of the book's full contents, which included images of male models in a state of undress alongside royal photographs. Elton disputed that explanation directly, writing that Versace had shown her the entire book beforehand and that she had said she loved it. Feeling blindsided, he wrote back holding nothing back, telling her plainly how much the withdrawal had cost the foundation and reminding her that she'd already seen everything in it. What came back, in his description, was a notably curt and formal reply, nothing like the warmth that had defined their friendship up to that point. Vanity Fair writer Tina Brown later characterized the resulting standoff as a genuine deep freeze between them. For months, two people who had once spoken constantly simply stopped. It's worth being honest here about something the public narrative often glosses over. We don't know with certainty why Diana pulled out, or what pressures, palace-related or otherwise, may have shaped her decision. Elton has only ever offered his side of that exchange. What is well documented is that the freeze between them lasted for a significant stretch of 1996 and into 1997, and that it ended only because of a shared tragedy. On July 15, 1997, the designer Gianni Versace was murdered outside his home in Miami. He had been a close friend to both Elton and Diana, and the news devastated them independently. According to Elton's own retelling, it was Diana who reached out first, breaking their long silence to check in on him and ask whether he'd spoken with Versace's sister, Donatella. The rift that had felt so significant weeks earlier suddenly seemed small in the face of real loss, and the two agreed to put it behind them. A week later, on July 22, they both attended Versace's funeral service at the Duomo di Milano. Elton, seated in the front row, was overcome with grief, and a widely circulated photograph from that day appears to show Diana leaning toward him to offer comfort, her hand resting near his shoulder. For years, that image was interpreted by the press as a tender moment of consolation. Elton later set the record straight himself, explaining that the photographers had actually caught Diana reaching past him for a mint that his partner, David Furnish, had offered her, and that what she'd murmured in that instant wasn't a word of comfort at all, but a light-hearted remark about wanting a polo mint. It's a detail that says a great deal about the actual texture of their friendship, more mischievous and unguarded than the solemn public image suggested, even in a moment of real grief. They left the cathedral that day with their friendship restored and made plans to have lunch together soon. Neither of them knew it would be the last time they saw each other alive. Just over 5 weeks later, in the early hours of August 31, 1997, Diana died in a car crash in Paris, at the age of 36. Elton has described the shock of that day as almost impossible to process, coming as it did so soon after Versace's death and so soon after he and Diana had finally reconciled. In the wake of her death, as the country entered an unprecedented period of public mourning, Elton received a call from his friend Richard Branson, who told him that mourners leaving messages in the condolence books outside Kensington Palace and St. James's Palace were quoting the lyrics to Elton's 1973 song Candle in the Wind, originally written with Bernie Taupin as a tribute to Marilyn Monroe. With the blessing of Diana's family, Branson suggested Elton rework the song for her. Elton called Taupin, and together they revised the lyrics, changing the famous opening line "Goodbye Norma Jean" to "Goodbye England's Rose." Elton has been candid that performing the reworked song at Diana's funeral, held at Westminster Abbey on September 6, 1997, was one of the hardest things he's ever done professionally. He later reflected that it was, in a strange way, the biggest performance of his life, watched by an enormous global audience, and yet it wasn't about him at all, it was entirely about saying goodbye to a friend. Watching Princes William and Harry, then 15 and 12 years old, walk behind their mother's coffin left a lasting impression on him. He described the way the boys were treated that day, exposed to that level of public grief at such young ages, as simply inhuman. The re-recorded version of Candle in the Wind, officially titled Candle in the Wind 1997, was released shortly after the funeral, with all royalties and proceeds directed to the Diana, Princess of Wales Memorial Fund. It went on to become one of the best-selling singles in recorded music history, with more than 30 million copies sold worldwide, breaking first-week sales records in both the United Kingdom and the United States. Despite that commercial success, Elton has always maintained a complicated relationship with the song. He has performed the original 1973 version at concerts many times since, but he has repeatedly declined to sing the 1997 rewrite in public again, even turning down the opportunity at the 2007 concert for Diana organized by her sons. He has said he considers that Westminster Abbey performance a singular, private act of mourning rather than a piece of his regular repertoire, and has stated he would only perform it again if William or Harry specifically asked him to. The days immediately following Diana's death were, by Elton's own description, some of the strangest and most disorienting of his life. He had lost 2 close friends within the span of 6 weeks, and the second loss came just as the first wound was beginning to close. He has spoken since about how surreal it felt to go from a warm, joking reunion at Versace's funeral to preparing, only weeks later, to sing at Diana's own service in front of a global television audience estimated in the hundreds of millions. There was no time to properly grieve before he was asked to perform grief publicly, on a stage bigger than any he had stood on before, and he has said that keeping his composure at the piano that day required a level of focus he had rarely needed in his career. A teleprompter was placed near him during the performance, not out of showmanship, but reportedly out of genuine concern that the emotion of the moment might cause him to lose his place in the new lyrics and fall back into the original words written for Marilyn Monroe decades earlier. In the years since Diana's death, Elton has quietly kept something closer to a promise than a public gesture. He has remained a steady presence in the lives of her 2 sons. He has hosted them, defended them publicly against intrusive press coverage, and, when Prince Harry began facing the kind of media pressure that had once surrounded his mother, Elton spoke out about it directly and offered his home in France as a refuge. Prince Harry has written about Elton's continued closeness to the family in his own memoir, including a moment where Elton remarked on how much Harry's son Archie resembled Diana. Elton has also supported charitable causes connected to the princes, including Harry's Cinebale organization, which assists children affected by HIV and AIDS in southern Africa, a natural continuation of the work he and Diana began together in the 1980s. Looking back across everything Elton has written and said about Diana over the years, the portrait that emerges isn't really a scandalous confession or a hidden secret the palace suppressed. It's something more grounded, a real friendship between 2 people who understood loneliness inside enormous fame, who occasionally hurt each other, who made up after tragedy forced their priorities into focus, and who never got the chance to fully repair the small rift that had briefly separated them before her death. Elton has said as much himself, describing the year they spent not speaking as one of his enduring regrets, and encouraging people not to let pride get in the way of relationships that matter. What Elton has actually confessed to, across interviews and his memoir, isn't a cover-up. It's a far more ordinary and more moving truth, that Diana was not the flawless, distant icon often presented to the public, but a funny, sharp, sometimes difficult friend who happened to also be one of the most famous women in the world, and that losing her left a permanent mark on the people who actually knew her. What do you think shaped Diana's public image more, the palace's careful management or the press's own myth-making? Let us know in the comments, and if you enjoyed this look at their friendship, be sure to like the video and subscribe for more.